Hey folks, welcome back. Today I wanted to talk about my latest seasoning expedition with the Firebox pans. So since my last seasoning video, there were a lot of comments on Buzzy Wax and grapeseed oil. I looked into Buzzy Wax and found that it uses a combination of beeswax, canola, and grapeseed oil. And with the current situation with my seasoning issues, it was an ideal time for me to test grapeseed oil. So that's what I did. I wasn't so happy with the performance of the seasoning with the other oils, so I decided to try grapeseed oil. For this test, I used this aluminum pie pan, one of my old pans, which is not anodized. This was after 6 layers of grapeseed oil, 500 degrees for 1 hour for the first 5 layers, and then 500 degrees for 3 hours on that final layer. This last layer, though, I started at 1 hour, but decided to see how far I can push it, and I added 2 more hours to it. No additional oil. As it should, with each consecutive hour, it became darker as the oil carbonized. This was enough evidence for me to strip my 10-inch pan down to the anodized aluminum and test grapeseed oil. I used the same process, but only did it for an hour for that last and final layer. I can tell you that it looked beautiful. I made some bacon on the stovetop, and it worked flawlessly until it came time to cleaning. I collected all the bacon grease and let it cool naturally before I cleaned it. I ran hot water over it and used a soft sponge with no soap to get the stuck bacon bits off the bottom. The seasoning just washed right off with little effort. Imagine my disappointment. At this point, I had to take a step back and really think about what's going on here, since this has been my experience with so many of the other oils. Is it the oil or is it my seasoning process? I jumped onto Google like any frustrated person would do and started researching. All the seasoning instructions you find on the interwebs gives you basically the same instructions. 480 degrees to 500 degrees for 1 hour for cast iron seasoning. That got me thinking. Cast iron is a much different material than aluminum. You probably need a good bit of that time for cast iron just to come up to temp. And then they instruct you to let it cool down and repeat the process. Aluminum, on the other hand, is highly conductive, so it heats up extremely fast. This led me to another question. Why are we using cast iron seasoning instructions for aluminum pans? Or does it really matter? Alright, so let's think about this more. If we use the current process of 500 degrees for 1 hour, then by the end of a 6-layer seasoning, that first layer would have endured 6 hours of 500 degree temps from direct contact with the aluminum. If you look at how grease carbonizes after a 4 to 5 hour oven self-cleaning cycle, you kind of see where I'm going with this. What we're really producing with this process is 3 layers of extremely carbonized oil, and probably only the last 2 to 3 layers that's actually polymerized. Could this be the reason it washed off so easily? Don't know. So I went back to the interwebs looking for a seasoning process specific for aluminum. Lo and behold, I found this gem buried deep in the fireboxstove.com instruction page. Links in the description. The process they outlined was 500 degrees for 30 minutes and 500 degrees for 1 hour for the last seasoning layer. That got the gears turning. Why only 30 minutes? So I'm going to get nerdy here for a second. Here's what we know. The smoke point of grapeseed oil is 420 degrees. We know through science, I have a link in the description for that too, that polymerization occurs at the smoke point of the oil, and carbonization occurs at temps above the smoke point. My theory for this old method is, the first few layers is getting the oil to a point of polymerization, and that last step of the 500 degrees for 1 hour will take all the layers to full polymerization, all the way through, to a point that it might even be starting to carbonize. So what you should end up having is one nice thick, well-fused layer of seasoning instead of 6 individual carbonized layers, I guess. Now that makes sense for cast iron, but what about aluminum? If we really want to be precise, we should be seasoning the first 5 layers at or around the smoke point long enough for the oil to dry or polymerize. Then for that final layer, I'd attempt higher than the smoke point for an hour as a best guess. I decided to test this with my 8-inch pan. For the 8-inch pan, I stripped it, but I used 450 degrees for 30 minutes for the first 5 layers. I did the final layer at 400 degrees for 1 hour. I used thin layers, wiped the oil on, then wiped it off with a different rag. I wanted the oil thin so it polymerizes at the same time. This is what I got. I left a little bit of the bacon sticky bits in there so you can see that I did use the pan after seasoning. As you can see, a stark different result after cleaning with the hot water and soft sponge. Some seasoning stripped away, but not like what I experienced before. I know that I need to dial in the last seasoning step since it's difficult to determine when carbonization actually occurs or when it's just too much. I know that with use, these layers will carbonize to its fullest point. So it's important to oil before and after cooking to ensure that we add back on what we actually cooked off when it comes to the seasoning. What's also important is that we properly heat the pan before using it to avoid sticking. Time to crack the code. There are 3 variables in the seasoning process which can affect the outcome: the amount of oil, temperature, and time. If I ensure to wipe off all the oil so it's a thin coat, that variable will remain consistent. I also think that 30 minutes is more than enough time for the aluminum pan to heat up and cook the oil, so I'm keeping that consistent. The only variable I'm going to change is temperature. So here's my process, or here's my new process for grapeseed oil. 425 degrees for 30 minutes, getting as close to the 420 degree smoke point for grapeseed oil. This will be for all of the base layers, whether I go from 1 to 6 to 5 to 10. Then 450 degrees for 30 minutes for the final layer. I used this process for the 10-inch pan. I cooked a whole mess of bacon and then some hash browns. I did get some sticking, but I think this is normal. Sticking is best remedied by ensuring your pan is properly heated. When I switched to the hash browns, my pan got a little cold, and I was a bit impatient. After everything was cooked, I let it cool, then washed it with hot water and a soft sponge. Check this out. Little to no flaking. Look at that. It's so beautiful, I want to cry. So what can we extrapolate from this? There is a fine line between polymerization and carbonization. Polymerization is great for seasoning longevity, but eventually it'll reach carbonization with use. Many of the instructions for seasoning try to accommodate for the variances in these 3 variables. From my testing, I understand this. The goal of seasoning is getting to full polymerization. I don't care about carbonization like some people do with cast iron, because we're not really trying to protect it from rusting. Know that this process has worked for me, but I'm only one use case. I'm going to continue to use this process for all of my pans, and we'll see what happens. Time will surely tell if this helps with my flaking issues. If you're still here watching this, I hope you give this process a thought, or just leave me a comment telling me how wrong I am. Now, if you somehow manage to stay awake and enjoy this video, please smash that like button. And if all this stuff is your cup of tea, please consider subscribing. Thanks again for watching, folks, and have a good burn.